Transmission start. Welcome to Where Did the Road Go? Join us as we wander off the path and explore lost history, consciousness, the paranormal, unexplained mysteries, alternative thought, and much more. We are present on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com. Now here is your host, Zechariah.
Hello, welcome to the show. Tonight I'm talking with Scott Creighton, the author of The Great Pyramid Hoax. And this book is filled with evidence, and we barely scratched the surface during this interview, and we even leave some of the most damning stuff out because you really need to read up to it to get the full effect of how massive this hoax really is and how much evidence there is for it. So go pick up the book. You won't regret it if you're interested in this stuff. It's not a super long read, but it is a very good read, very interesting, and extremely well done. Before we get to that, real quick, help us out, become a patron of the show. $3 a month is all we ask, and it helps us greatly. I'm going to be floating a new shirt design by the patrons, as they get to see it first, and hopefully we're going to have some merchandise very, very soon. There was an extra segment with Steph Young that went out to patrons as well, and of course her show will be starting at the end of this month, at the end of January. And I believe we're also going to have another show mixed in with Where Did the Road Go, starting sometime at the end of the month, beginning of next month. We'll get more to that maybe next week. As always, everything Where Did the Road Go can be found at wheredidtheroadgo.com, and with no further ado, here's my talk with Scott Creighton. And I am joined today by Scott Creighton. And Scott, you have a new book out called The Great Pyramid Hoax, The Conspiracy to Conceal the True History of Ancient Egypt. And this is your third book, correct?
Yeah, that's correct, Zechariah. It's good to be here again.
And this is a really good book. This is something that really needed to be done. And I'm glad that you stepped up and did it. It has a great intro from Laird Scranton. And you're basically dealing with the idea that Howard Weiss did not find markings in the pyramid, but he created them.
Well, yeah, that's the book in a nutshell, Zechariah. This guy, Howard Weiss, he was just to give you a bit of sort of general background on who this guy actually was. He went to Egypt in 1837, so that's nearly 200 years ago. He was basically from a wealthy upper class, fairly upper class, wealthy military family, and with large estates down in Buckinghamshire in England, the southeast of England. He was basically a sort of military martinet, what we would call a military martinet, basically a sort of strict disciplinarian, and a guy that we know from some of the research that I've done that he'd very little humour and was very much a believer in the Bible. Well, when I say that, the literal truth of the Bible. He believed in the biblical flood. He believed in the creation took place in 4004 BC. I'm not saying there's anything wrong at all with that. Pointing out is that these were the views of Weiss. This was a time in which he lived in. A time when the church pretty much had a say and pretty much controlled much of everyday life in Britain and other parts of the world. So the other thing about Weiss to understand is that his family were also very much into politics. And this is one of the things that we know for absolute certain about Howard Weiss is that in 1807, he bribed his way into the British Parliament to become a member of Parliament down in Westminster. And the evidence for that particular act, which was illegal in 1807, is presented in the book. So that's just a little summary of who this guy was. And as I say, like a lot of Europeans at that time, they would embark on a trip to the Near East, Egypt, Nubia, and probably a lot of them onwards to make a pilgrimage almost to the Holy Land. So this is kind of what Weiss was doing in 1837, although he restricted his trip to Lower and Upper Egypt.
Okay, and the person who brought this concept through was Zechariah Sitchin, and that's actually Fate magazine had run a bit on him, and I think it was called The Great Pyramid Hoax or something very similar, and it was just kind of an excerpt talking about these marks being faked and stuff, and that's what actually got introduced me to Zechariah Sitchin initially, and I thought it was fascinating, and of course as time went on, you had even Graham Hancock turn around and say, well, I don't think these marks could have been faked, and kind of withdraw his support of that idea. And as you say in the book, Zechariah kind of had the right idea, but he didn't really back up his work quite right.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Sariah. Zechariah, I think, was very much on the right track. He believed these marks in these chambers were faked by Howard Weiss. He presented some evidence in his previous books, Stairway to Heaven, Journeys to the Mythical Past, and basically some of the evidence that he presented in those books, it's still valid to this very day, Sariah. It's still, it's meaningful and it stood the test of time. But there's some things that he got wrong. He plainly got wrong. And because of those things that he got wrong in those two books, basically, the way how this thing works, the orthodox traditional scholars and academia jump on it, and before you know it, they throw the baby out with the bathwater. Everything's thrown out. Forget the stuff that Zechariah actually got right, and some of the very relevant and pertinent points that he raised about this issue. Because he gets a couple of things wrong, the whole lot's chucked out. That's no way to deal with things. It's just not. And you mentioned earlier about Graham Hancock. Yeah, guys like Baval and Hancock, because Zechariah got these things, some things wrong, some things muddled, didn't take the time to investigate the whole thing, deeply enough. And there was flaws found there. So people like Graham Hancock and Robert Baval, they gradually, although they initially went along and endorsed what Zechariah Sitchin was saying, they eventually backed off and distanced themselves from Zechariah's work. But funnily though, more recently, I think Graham Hancock, I think it was probably in about maybe the early 2000s, maybe a little bit earlier than that he distanced himself from Zechariah's work. But actually, just a couple of years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, he actually posted on his Graham Hancock website that he, because of some of the research that I'd been doing, and that some others I think had been doing at the time, he basically said that some interesting questions have been raised about these marks, and he basically said, just to paraphrase him, that he may have been too quick to throw out the forgery theory, and that he himself may have thrown out the baby with the bathwater and dismissing the whole forgery thing. And he goes as far to say that the Khufu cartouche in these chambers, that could have been faked because it is in plain sight. It's easily accessible. It's not any of these marks which we're told go behind blocks, and it's difficult to get a paintbrush into them. So Graham now realises that, well, maybe I was a bit rash to discount the forgery hypothesis. So he now is a bit more open-minded. He's basically come back again. I'm not saying he endorses it, but he's come back again to, basically to look at the rest of the evidence, the new evidence that has recently come forward, particularly in my new book.
Okay. Now Howard Weiss. This took place in him going into the Great Pyramid took place 1837. Was that it?
That's right. Yep.
Okay, and he, like a lot of people, just went in there strong-armed, his way through the pyramid, blowing stuff up. That's how he found the so-called relieving chambers above the king's chamber.
Yeah.
And these were, and even the idea that they're relieving chambers seemed kind of ridiculous. And you go into that a little bit in the book too, because there's a lot more pressure on the queen's chamber than the king's chamber. Why wouldn't the queen's chamber need these relieving chambers?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's another one of the many mysteries of the construction of the Great Pyramid. The Queen's Chamber has not. I mean, we're told that these relieving chambers above the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid, there's 5 of them, and each of these chambers are pretty much identical except for the last one. All the other ones have a flat roof like the King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid, but each chamber is only about, or 4 of the 5 are only about 3 feet high. When you're inside them, you have to crouch. You have to crouch down. But the topmost chamber, the 5th chamber, is known as Campbell's Chamber. That's got a sloping roof, a gabled roof, so you can actually stand up in that chamber. And that was the final chamber that Howard Weiss went into. But as we say, why the ancient Egyptians ever built these chambers is a mystery, because to me, why are engineers saying that, well, they built these to relieve pressure on the roof of the King's Chamber, when the roof of the Queen's Chamber has none of these relieving chambers, and there's a lot more of the pyramid bearing down, a lot more weight bearing down on the Queen's Chamber roof than there is on the King's Chamber roof, because that's much higher up in the pyramid, so there's less pyramid weight on top of that chamber. So it's just a mystery why these chambers were built. But in terms of these marks, the curious thing about these marks is that the very first of these relieving chambers, that's known as Davidsons chamber, and it's the lowest one of these 5 chambers. Weiss only opened 4 of these 5 chambers. Davidson's chamber, the very lowest, just directly above the King's Chamber, that had already been opened. It had been discovered about 70 years before Weiss ever went to Egypt by a chap called Nathaniel Davison. And, when Davison went into that chamber 70 years previously, the curious thing is, and this is something that Zechariah points out in his earlier works, is that not a single mark, hieroglyph or hieratic sign was found in Davidson's chamber. And there's been a whole load of people that have, been in that chamber and thoroughly examined it. So why is there no painted marks in that chamber, and yet all the chambers that Weiss opened, we find all these painted marks? The pyramid, it's an anonymous structure, as you probably know. All these early giant pyramids are completely anonymous structures. What I mean by that is that there are no official inscriptions whatsoever in any of these early giant pyramids. Not one official inscription anywhere. The only writing that is in any of these first giant pyramids are these marks, these painted marks, allegedly found by Howard Weiss in 1837. But it's a big mystery, and a bit suspect, in my opinion, as to why nowhere else in the pyramid, although there's one other place which I'll touch on later, are any of these painted marks found. No writing anywhere official. The only writing we have are these marks discovered by Weiss.
And for anyone who's not aware, the other pyramids in Egypt are loaded down with hieroglyphics and such.
Well, the later, some of the smaller later pyramids certainly have marks or hieroglyphics in them. These are known as the pyramid texts. But these pyramids are from later dynasties. They're not, in my opinion, comparable with the early giant pyramids. The monster pyramids, the first pyramids that the ancient Egyptians built. I believe we're talking about two completely separate, I wouldn't quite say cultures, but definitely, different people with different skill sets built these different pyramids. You can see, in the giant pyramids, the skill set and, the precision, the engineering that went into those particular pyramids. Compare that with the much smaller, inferior, almost mud brick pyramids. Not all mud brick, but a lot of them use mud brick, compared to dressed stone in the giant pyramids. So we're talking about completely different pyramids here. I'm talking about the giant pyramids, the first, what I call the first 16 pyramids that the ancient Egyptians constructed. I'm not discussing here about the later inferior, the smaller pyramids at all. But in those pyramids, as you say, there are hieroglyphs known as the pyramid texts in a few of those pyramids.
Okay. How did anyone even know there were chambers above the king's chamber?
Well, that's an interesting question. We don't really know how it started. Well, it started with Nathaniel Davison discovering Davidson's chamber, but we don't know. There's no record anywhere of how Nathaniel Davison actually found that chamber. All it tells us is he found it. It doesn't say whether that chamber had already been open, and because it's difficult to get to this particular Davidson's chamber, because it's away. If you go to the far end of the Grand Gallery in the Great Pyramid, you then have to go to the very top, the roof of the Grand Gallery at the far end of the Grand Gallery to actually find the opening, a tiny opening into this Davidson's chamber. And you need, a ladder about, 20 feet, maybe more tall to get up there. So how Nathaniel Davison spotted it, or thought that there would be anything up there, let alone to go to all the trouble and get a big ladder and go and search it. But anyway, that's apparently what he did, and it was open. Now, what happened later, when Weiss was at Egypt in 1837, he was working with an Italian chap, Giovanni Caviglia, and together they were excavating the Great Pyramid at Giza at that time. And Caviglia apparently, they had a bit of a falling out, these two guys, and Caviglia basically blamed Weiss for usurping his ideas and his discoveries, and complained that Weiss, having got this information from Caviglia, basically ensured that Caviglia was booted off the site. Caviglia talks about this in various letters at length, but that's his side of the story. Caviglia's story. Weiss himself paints a slightly different version of that story, which you would probably come to expect. But anyway, Caviglia apparently told Weiss that when he was in Davidson's chamber, because Caviglia apparently lived in Davidson's chamber when he was excavating inside the Great Pyramid in 1836, 1837, and he apparently put a reed, a straw, a long straw, or reed, through a small gap in one of the ceiling joints of Davidson's chamber, and it didn't stop. It just kept going and going and going, and he realised then that, wait, there must be another chamber above this one that he was living in, and he told Weiss about this. Obviously, they looked around. There was nowhere else to get in above Davidson's chamber, and apparently they then had a fallout. Caviglia ended up getting kicked off the site, and apparently these guys were partners, in this venture. with another British colonel, Colonel Patrick Campbell. So these three guys were in this venture together, but it seemed for whatever reason, Caviglia was the one that discovered this, but ended up getting kicked off the site. And then after that, Weiss decided that he would use gunpowder to blast his way to find an opening into this chamber above Davidsons. Because Weiss was, if you read Weiss's published book, Zechariah, what you'll find is that he says in his published work that he wanted to find the mummy, the coffer of Khufu, because it was never found in the main king's chamber. Nothing really was found in the main king's chamber. So it had been assumed, I think, for quite some time that Khufu's true burial place must be in some other chamber, hidden chamber somewhere else in the pyramid. And so Weiss believed that it was probably in one of these hidden chambers above Davidsons. He also tells us that he wanted to find a cartouche somewhere, because Weiss had a motive. We're not entirely sure what his motive was for placing any of these marks inside the pyramid, but obviously he would have had a motive of some kind, some description. I speculate in the book what those might have been. Mm-hmm. But the point, the simple point here is that he tells us in his book, his published account, that he wanted to find a cartouche or Khufu's mummy or a cartouche. Finding the cartouche would help to date the pyramid. So he tells us this. The thing as well, other countries like France and Germany and Italy, they had field researchers, excavators in Egypt at that time as well. This was a time when Egypt was starting to open up its secrets again. Champollion, Jean-Francois Champollion, had only about 15 years earlier, cracked the hieroglyphic code, and we were beginning to understand ancient Egyptian language. So it was a time when, Egypt past was beginning to be uncovered again and to be revealed again to us. So all these people were making all these discoveries in and around Giza and elsewhere in Egypt, important discoveries. And Weiss, he was making some discoveries, but not the important discoveries that he wanted to make. And he tells us those in his book, either, Khufu's mummy or a cartouche that would allow them to date the pyramid. That was important discoveries that he himself declares in his published work that he wanted to find.
Right. The just blowing his way up there. I mean, obviously there was these chambers were not meant to be opened back up. They were sealed and obviously not meant for re-entry at any point in the future. Otherwise, there would have been a way into them. Or even if we blew our ways in, we would have found our way in. I've always liked the idea that these had something to do with acoustics. How does that theory sit with you?
Well, I've read little bits and pieces about the acoustics of the various chambers of the Great Pyramid. It's not something I personally have went into in any great depth, but it's certainly it's certainly interesting. It's certainly fascinating. When you consider the granite blocks in these chambers, of the Great Pyramid, the relieving chambers. One side, or rather three sides of them, are perfectly smooth, and the top side of them is it's quite wavy. It's not smooth at all. It's sort of undulating, so it's almost like some kind of tuning fork or some kind of it's just bizarre, and obviously quartz as well inside this granite. It can vibrate at certain frequencies and all that kind of stuff. But as I said, it's not. I find it interesting. I find it curious, and I tend, if there's some good articles about it, I'll tend to read them. If there's anything to all that, it would be amazing to think that there was, and maybe there is, but for me, I personally would like I would like to know if there was, to be honest.
Okay. So Vice blasts his way in there, and
Yeah.
the what Zechariah said was that he had found nothing there, and so he painted the cartouches and everything else in there. Now, what did Zechariah get wrong?
Right. Okay. Okay. Well, there was a couple of things. He talks about the cartouche in Campbell's chamber. Um, that's the main one that Zechariah focused on. That's the topmost chamber. There was a number of cartouches found in a couple of the other chambers, on his way up to Campbell's chamber. But this cartouche in Campbell's chamber is the one Zechariah concentrated on. Now, inside this cartouche, this cartouche is painted onto the sloping roof block of Campbell's chamber using a red paint called ochre paint. It's basically an iron oxide mixed with water that the ancient used, and it was still available, incidentally, in 1837. It was still being made in Egypt in 1837. Now, these marks supposedly were painted onto these blocks by the quarry gangs. The gangs at the quarries that were, hewing these blocks, these rectangular roof blocks and wall blocks out of the quarries. When they had, managed to cut one of these blocks out of the quarry, they would basically put their mark, their gang name on each block. And that's how, when the block is then delivered to the pyramid and put into a wall of one of these chambers or into the roof of one of these chambers, that's how Egyptologists say that these gang names, these crew names or quarry marks ended up inside these chambers. So it's important to kind of understand that little bit of background there. Now, each quarry gang would have, as I said, its own name, and these names of the quarry gangs would often include the name of the king. In this case, quarry gang names were called Friends of Khufu. The White Crown of Khufu is powerful. Names like that. And the cartouche would be part of their gang name. So it wasn't just the Khufu cartouche, it was the Friends of Khufu. It's a whole piece of text. That was the full gang name. Now, in the Khufu cartouche, there's a small circle. That's one of the signs. The cartouche is basically an oval which goes round a group of signs. And it's a distinctive oval because this oval identifies the name of the king. It's unique. The cartouche always contains signs which are the name of the king. And Egyptologists in 1837, they understood this. Now, the cartouche of Khufu had a small circle inside it, and Zechariah claimed that this circle should be drawn with diagonal lines because he'd seen this in the inventory stela, another ancient piece of text carved onto a stone in Egypt. Now, that for a start simply isn't true. These lines in this circle do not have to be diagonal, as Zechariah claimed. They can be horizontal, or they can even be vertical. The other thing Zechariah said was that the Khufu cartouche that he went, what you have to understand, is that Weiss asked one of his assistants, a guy called J.R. Hill, to copy these marks on a 1-to-1 ratio onto sheets of facsimile sheets. And Hill did this. And Zechariah went to see these drawings made by Mr. Hill, these facsimile drawings. They're actually in the British Museum. You can go and see them if you're ever in London. And Zechariah looked at Mr. Hill's drawings and he said that the Khufu cartouche in Campbell's chamber, or in the pyramid, it was it was drawn wrong in Mr. Hill's drawings. He said that the disc in Mr. Hill's drawings had a centre dot in the disc, and that was blasphemous. An ancient Egyptian, scribe would never have drawn Khufu's name wrong, that's correct. They wouldn't. But what Zechariah wrote in his book, saying that this disc, which he saw, the Khufu cartouche, had a centre dot. I don't know what Zechariah was looking at, because I went to look at the very same facsimile drawings made by J.R. Hill, and when I looked at the drawings, they all have the horizontal lines in the drawings. There's some, as I said, there's a number of these cartouches, but the one in Campbell's chamber, it's got the 3 lines in Mr. Hill's drawing. When you look at the drawing in Campbell's chamber, the circle, it's got the 3 lines, just like Mr. Hill's facsimile. So Zechariah got that wrong. How could he get something like that wrong? You have to ask, what was he looking at?
Yeah.
So there's things like that, and when you get something as obvious and something as basic as that wrong in your research, you're going to get pretty severely criticised by the traditionalists.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Now, one of the arguments that you make a good case against here is that some of these marks couldn't have been made because they go under other beams, that they're in locations where someone couldn't have painted them in place, that they had to have been painted at the quarry and brought in. This book, you are so thorough in this book and going over so many of these arguments for and against whether or not these markings were there when Weiss opened these chambers. And as you said, the initial chamber on the bottom had no markings at all. It was only the ones that Weiss opened that has any markings whatsoever. And you went and looked at all of his unpublished works, his diary and his journal and his other books, to try and get an idea whether or not there was any evidence in there for him having planned anything like this.
Yeah. That's correct. I mean, there was a number of reasons for wanting to look at Weiss's private journal, his handwritten field notes. There was a number of reasons I had for wanting to do that, and I tried looking for them a couple of times, not seriously looking for them, I have to say, but kind of half-heartedly looking for them. And then eventually one day, I just casually did a search on the internet, and they popped up. The reference had obviously been recently scanned or whatever and placed into the archive of the archive unit of the British Museum, the Aylesbury Archive Centre. That's where the Weiss Private Journal exists now. When I saw, my wife and Louise, we went down and we were actually looking for something else in Weiss's journal, private journal. He talks about a guy called Humphreys Brewer, or rather Sitchin does, talks about this guy Humphreys Brewer who was working with Weiss at Giza and saw Mr. Hill and another of Weiss's assistant, Mr. Raven, painting marks inside the pyramid. And so this was an eyewitness to this actual fraud that was going on. But the strange thing is, this guy Humphreys Brewer is not mentioned anywhere in Weiss's published books. So I wanted to see, I'm thinking, well, come on, it's pretty much, a foregone conclusion that if you've got a guy that's saying to Weiss, you're a fraudster and your assistants here are a bunch of frauds as well, you're not going to be mentioned at all anywhere in his published account. In fact, you're going to be written right out of that account, and your existence at Giza is never going to be mentioned. So what I wanted to find And that's, to me, that's why he's not mentioned in the published book. That to me is a big sign that something dodgy really was happening at Giza, the very fact that they don't mention Humphreys Brewer. So I wanted to see, well, okay, there must have been a time when, before this altercation happened between Brewer and Weiss and his assistants, there must have been a time before that when they were all in good terms. And I thought, well, if that was the case, then Brewer may have been mentioned earlier before this event in Weiss's private diary and just redacted from the published account. So that was the reason why I wanted to find these diaries. But my goodness, when I actually found them, and my wife Louise and I, we went down and spent a couple of days there. There's like 600 pages of this guy's handwritten notes, and the handwriting's really difficult to read, really difficult to read. But fortunately, because he published a book based on these handwritten notes, it was fairly easy to cross-reference certain things and to get certain words from the published pages. You could cross-reference them. So when my wife Louise and I, when we finally got our hands and we were looking through these pages, we found a lot more in there than we had ever bargained for. We were just looking to find if Humphreys Brewer was mentioned, but we've found a whole lot more in those diaries than that.
Yeah, you found some pretty damning evidence of him pre-planning this hoax, and let's leave that for a moment and look at like the actual ochre paint itself. Now there was a German group, you mentioned them in here, who had taken a piece of it to go try and carbon date it and stuff, because this has never been done. It's never been carbon dated. It's never been questioned. Now, is this the same group that Zahi freaked out about and insisted they stole the entire cartouche and all this stuff?
Yeah, that's exactly it, Zechariah. Yeah, it's the same guys. It's Dr. Dominic Gorlitz and Stefan Erdmann, a couple of German university graduates. Now, the world media just went total berserk with that story. Don't get me wrong, I'm not defending Dominic or Stefan. I think they themselves probably regret what they did, but let's keep our feet in the ground here. They didn't touch the cartouche of Khufu at all. They took a small sample of paint from a relatively innocuous sign elsewhere in the chamber, out of the way. They went nowhere near taking or damaging the cartouche itself. I'm not saying what they did is right, but let's get the facts out there. They didn't touch the cartouche.
Right.
Saw another sign elsewhere in the chamber, and when they, as you say, they did take this sample, because what they would do with the ochre paint, the ancient Egyptians would sometimes mix organic material, because iron oxide itself, you can't carbon date, and you can't carbon date water, but sometimes they would put organic material such as gum or honey or fish oil into the mix to kind of act as a binding agent for the paint. So that would kind of make the paint a lot less runny when they're applying it to a wall or whatever. And obviously you can carbon test organic matter. So that's what Dominic and Stefan were hoping to do. But unfortunately, as Dominic explained to me, the sample wasn't large enough. The sample that they took was too small for them to be able to successfully go ahead with carbon dating. But the chemical analysis that the German laboratory did provide other significant evidence, and very compelling evidence, to show that these marks were indeed faked.
And what was that?
Well, basically, what the chemical analysis showed was that the paint, the ochre paint, had been painted onto not a limestone block, but plaster. Yeah, it had been painted onto plaster. That's calcium sulfate, and whereas Egyptologists expected it to be painted onto calcium carbonate. Now, the importance of that is that the roof block itself, this means the roof block itself must have been, once they put the block in place, they coated the roof block with a layer of plaster, which is, it's not surprising. You'd maybe expect them to do that for a number of reasons. Now, the significance then is that tells us the marks were, obviously they would have to wait for the plaster to dry. The roof block is put in place in the Great Pyramid, the plaster is applied to it, and then once that's dried, the paint is then painted on top of the plaster, because that's obviously what the chemical analysis found. The problem here is, why were they painting the signs upside down on plaster in situ? You know, you've then got a scribe, supposedly, if this plaster, you know, these are painted in situ, but the scribe, remember, these are supposedly done at the quarry. That's the reason why Egyptologists tell us the marks are genuine, because they were done at the quarry. That's why they're upside down and rotated sideways, etc., in these chambers, because that's how they appear. Only a few of them are actually upright. The signs are actually the right way up, you know, when you're standing in the chamber viewing them. So what we have here then is supposedly marks that were painted in situ, not at the quarries, in situ, but a scribe decided to paint them upside down in situ. Now, why would an ancient Egyptian scribe do that?
Yeah.
That's what the plaster proves.
Yeah. And that's just one piece of many pieces in this book that you show that the idea of these being ancient markings just doesn't hold up. One of the big arguments that they are is that some of these run underneath other blocks. So do you want to address that a bit?
Okay, Egyptologists basically claim that the marks must be genuine because some of them are in inaccessible places, you know, tight gaps between, you know, two adjoining blocks where you could barely get a brush, you know, between the gaps, let alone paint anything meaningful. Now, the first thing to say about that is, yeah, I accept that. But by the same token, there are no cartouches whatsoever been found between any of these gaps. The cartouches are all in open, clear, open and accessible areas of these chambers. You know, so you could just walk up and paint it straight onto the wall. They're not in any of these tight gaps. The second point I would say is that I spoke to Graham Hancock about this, because I've not actually been in these chambers. Graham's been in them, and he told me that the marks to him just looked like random mason's marks, like arrows and mason's marks. They didn't look like there were Egyptian or registers of Egyptian hieratic markings. It was just like basic mason's marks, like lines and triangles and things like that. Weren't actually like, you know, regular hieratic hieroglyphic signs. And the third thing to say is that even if there are marks, even if there were a cartouche to be found, let's say there isn't, but let's suppose someone next week discovered a cartouche between, you know, two closely fitted blocks. They shine a torch into the gap and they see the outline of a cartouche in there. Well, it could still have been placed there without a brush. And explain how that's done. It's very easily done, and you don't need a paintbrush to get that cartouche into that onto the side of a block in that tight gap. You don't need a brush to do it. Just a bit of lateral thinking. You can get that onto that block in that tight gap.
And like you said, the cartouches aren't found there. The cartouches are found where anyone could have painted them.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I think there's about 6 cartouches in all throughout these chambers. And here's another curious thing, Zechariah. In the very first chamber that Howard Weiss opened, this is Wellington's chamber, named after the Duke of Wellington, the great hero of the British wars against Napoleon, the Duke of Wellington. So he names this Wellington's chamber. It's the first chamber he opened. Remember what I've said earlier, and he tells us in his published book he wanted to find Khufu's mummy or a cartouche that might help them date the pyramid. Okay, he says this quite specifically in his book. Now, he goes into Wellington's chamber, and in that chamber, he writes, in his private notes, he writes, now this was the second time he'd visited this chamber, and they'd been examining this chamber minutely, okay? And he writes afterwards, when he goes back to his tent that night, he's sitting at his desk with his oil lamp and he's writing his notes up for that day. And in those notes of that night, he writes, was in Wellington's chamber, there were some odd marks, but nothing like hieroglyphics. Some odd painted marks, but nothing like hieroglyphics. And then when we go to read his published book, reading the same night, exact same date, same night, he writes, we found quarry marks. So there you have right away a big contradiction. He's saying in his private notes, his private thoughts, he tells us privately there was nothing there. Now, you got to believe that. You got to believe this is him writing at his desk of what happened that day, that night.
Right.
So this is genuinely what happened. So he says there was nothing there. There were no hieroglyphics there, and then hieroglyphic quarry marks there. And then in his published book, he says we found the quarry marks. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. So what quarry marks did they find in Wellington's chamber? Well, then you go to the British Museum. You look at the facsimile drawings that J.R. Hill did of all the quarry marks, and you find one there from Wellington's chamber. Guess what it is, Zechariah? It's a cartouche of Khufu from Wellington's chamber. Now, the thing is, Weiss tells us he was, almost desperate by this time because he wasn't, finding anything anywhere. And on this night, he says there was nothing. The very thing, Zechariah, the very thing he was hoping to find a cartouche that might date the pyramid, he mentions not one word about. This is, Zechariah, this is his eureka moment. This is his eureka moment. He's found the cartouche that he's been desperate to find. And yet in his private notes, Zechariah, his private notes, we found nothing like hieroglyphics and no mention of a cartouche of a king at all mentioned anywhere. And yet you go to the British Museum and there's a cartouche from that chamber where he said he didn't find any. There was no hieroglyphics to be found.
So what initially made Egyptologists date the Great Pyramid to Khufu before Weiss found these marks?
Well, it was it's a good question, Sir. It was all very fluffy and tenuous. There was these stories about Herodotus had said the pyramid was built by. He doesn't say Khufu; he says Sufis or Cheops. Or he says Sufis, was built by Sufis, and later Egyptologists managed to somehow contort and transliterate Sufis into the name Khufu. Okay, so, but then Herodotus the father of history, that's one of his names. One of his other appellations is the father of lies. He was writing about 2,000 years himself after the Great Pyramid has supposedly been constructed. So this was, Herodotus is writing, the same distance in time-wise from you to the time when Jesus Christ lived, and myself and your listeners from now to when Jesus Christ lived. That's the kind of time span we're talking about from Herodotus to the Great Pyramid. So it's a vast amount of time. And, he says Khufu built the pyramid. Well, there's a stela called the Inventory Stela that tells us that Khufu was repairing all sorts of monuments at Giza, including the Sphinx. So it wouldn't surprise me if, obviously Herodotus says this was 2,000 years ago, that Khufu was building the pyramid. But it wouldn't actually surprise me if, in actual fact, Khufu was already repairing an ancient structure in his time. The pyramid was already ancient in his time, because it tells us he repaired the Sphinx. The Sphinx had severe damage to its head. This inventory stela tells us this. When you look at the damage and you read about the damage that the Sphinx's head had, and it tells us it was repaired, and you go and look at the repair and you compare the notes with what the inventory stela says, it's a perfect match. So the inventory stela, what it tells us as well, the Sphinx was painted in ancient times, and there's actually ancient traces of paint on the Sphinx. So the inventory stela is telling us all these things that are factually correct, and factually been checked and correct. They've been verified. But then it says this thing, Khufu repaired the Sphinx. Oh, that's when Egyptology, it throws a whole lot out. Oh, no, that can't be. That's just nonsense. But, Zechariah, there's all this other stuff that's fact. So why all these facts? And that's not the only fact. There's a whole series of different facts that the inventory stela states. But the one thing, Egyptologists, yeah, that's fine. Tick that, tick, yeah, that's good. Oh, Khufu repaired the Sphinx. Oh, no, that's just nonsense. The whole thing's just nonsense. It gets chucked out because it says that one thing that they simply can't, fit into their timeline. Khufu repaired the Sphinx. Well, how could Khufu repair the Sphinx if apparently it was Khufu's son that built the Sphinx when, Khufu died? The Sphinx shouldn't have existed in Khufu's time because it was his successor that supposedly built it according to the conventional narrative. So how could Khufu be repairing it? Not only that, why would he be repairing it? I mean, that suggests if Khufu's repairing it, it must have already been really old in Khufu's time to be repairing it. So there you have, this timeline which just, it just doesn't fit. So Herodotus, when he's saying, the Great Pyramid was built, 2,000 years previously, I basically think, just like the Sphinx, inventory stela tells us Khufu was repairing the Sphinx. I think he was repairing, the Great Pyramid as well, and probably other monuments at the Giza site. It wouldn't surprise me in the least.
And I know Graham has suggested that there may have been two building times for the Great Pyramid, like the bigger blocks were put in, and then maybe construction stalled for some points, and eventually it was finished with smaller blocks later on.
I think that is probably partially correct. I think my own view of this is that possibly the core of the Great Pyramid and the other pyramids at Giza are actually step pyramids. They're actually step pyramids. And the Fourth Dynasty Egyptians may have converted them into true pyramids. You can see that at Meidum. If you look at the pyramid that Snefru, Khufu's father, supposedly built at Meidum, what you find there is that the pyramid has a centre stepped pyramid core. And apparently Snefru tried to convert the step pyramid that he supposedly built into a true pyramid. but the outer, smooth true pyramid casing all collapsed. And the reason it collapsed is because the step pyramid itself had been built on solid bedrock, but Khufu was building on sand. Now that tells you right away there's two different builders there with two different, technical understandings about how to build, a stable structure. One civilization knew it and the other didn't. Snefu didn't. They were kind of learning as went along. Another curious thing you find about the Meidum pyramid is that the core of that pyramid, the step pyramid, it's actually got casing stones to finish that as a step pyramid, which is quite unusual. It's actually got casing stones to finish it as a step pyramid. And as I said, Snefu came along and converted into a smooth-sided true pyramid that collapsed, or the outer casing collapsed. So that's what I think we're seeing at Giza as the lower part. We're seeing the lower massive step pyramid, or the massive blocks, the lower blocks of a step pyramid. And I think if you were to look inside the Great Pyramid, you would find that it is itself also a step pyramid. And you can see this with the Queen's pyramids, the small satellite pyramids at Giza. The core of those pyramids are step pyramids also, and have been converted to true pyramids.
Huh. Well, that's really interesting. I did not know any of that. So, what do you think the time frame difference would have been between like the step pyramid creation and the true pyramid finalization? I guess you could say.
Yeah. Well, this is obviously going off. The Great Pyramid Hoax book. This is kind of more touching on the work I've done in my previous book. The thing to keep in mind, the Great Pyramid Hoax is purely mainstream. It's basically about a particular event in 1837, that is being challenged. This book challenges mainstream history. It's not, the Great Pyramid Hoax is not about, alternative ideas about this or that. It's basically challenging, a mainstream tenet. But my previous work, the Secret Chamber of Osiris, the Lost Knowledge of the 16 Pyramids, that goes into more about the timeline and basically what I believe the whole thing was all about. I think it was about the first 16 pyramids and not the later, the smaller, more inferior pyramids. I think the smaller, inferior pyramids were essentially built as a homage to the first giant pyramids. Timeline-wise, I explain in the previous book my idea is that the pyramids, there's evidence, good evidence that Giza is an astronomical clock, a stellar clock, and it points to a remote date in antiquity, which is much older than 4,500 years ago. It's much older than Robert Bauval's 10,500 years ago. It goes right back to a time when the great ice sheets in North America and Europe, these great ice sheets suddenly, for whatever reason, 20,000 years ago, suddenly went into meltdown. We don't know what happened to cause that event, but the stellar clock at Giza points to 20,000 years ago.
And I know we had you on probably about a year ago for that book, but I don't remember all the details anymore. But okay, so let's get back to the hoax. Let's touch on a few more of the things in here. And like I said, there's a lot of information here, and you go into a lot of detail. And I highly recommend if people have any doubts about what you're saying, they pick up the book and actually read it, because you have provided a wealth of evidence here to support pretty much everything you're saying. And one of the things I found really interesting is you talk about how some of these paintings that are going under other blocks or look like they're going under blocks actually seem to have run down along the crack between the blocks, like the paint was wet and it dripped down into the crack of the blocks.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. There's this goes back to what I was talking about earlier about the ochre paint. If it's doesn't have like a binding agent, it can be very runny. And what you see on the wall of Campbell's chamber, they painted the cartouche from the bottom near the ledge. There's a low supporting wall just below the gabled roof block where the cartouche has been painted. They started painting from that bottom corner, and that's where the paint was loaded onto the brush. That's where you're starting. So the paint on the brush at that point is pretty full on the brush, and they're going round, trying to go around in one single sweep. And this was the analysis of an artist, a master of arts, a chap called John Snape. He did the analysis of the brushstrokes and the brushstroke sequence of the marks in this chamber. And it tells us an awful lot about how these marks were painted. And you can see where the paint has run. The paint has actually, in this bottom right-hand corner, it has run down to this seam, this ledge, where the support wall butts against or joins onto the gabled roof block, and in the crack there you can see that the paint has kind of run, right along that seam, if you like. It almost looks as if there was maybe a paint spillage or something, but there's a lot of paint there when you look at the photographs of it on the internet. But yeah, in the actual cartouche itself, you can see that some of the paint, where it was at its heaviest when first applied to the wall, has run down vertically. Now that's unlikely to happen if that block was at the quarry. It's unlikely to have run in that particular manner at the quarry. And as I said, also that John Snape, who did he's a master of arts, who did the analysis of the brush strokes. We can also tell that the brush strokes were drawn from the top of the roof block downwards. Now this means that you have to imagine that these signs are rotated 90 degrees from being properly upright, so they're kind of on their side. Now, so you're looking at these marks from top to bottom on their side. That means that they've been painted top to bottom on this roof block. That means if that roof block was at the quarry, it would have been drawn or painted onto the block from left to right. You understand?
Yeah, yeah.
The problem with that is the ancient Egyptians didn't write left to right, they wrote right to left. That's the kind of detail that the book goes into. There's a lot of very fine, a lot of very minute detail. But Zechariah, the devil is in the detail. That's where you catch these people out. You've got to look at it that closely. And what we also have to remember, I should probably have said this right at the top of the show tonight, Zechariah, is that these quarry marks are so important to Egyptology. This essentially, these marks, these are their holy grail of evidence that this pyramid belonged to Khufu. And because of that, they knew when Khufu lived. Yeah, because they know when Khufu lived, they found these Khufu cartouche in a sealed chamber. That means it's Khufu's, thus by extension, the date of the pyramid must be 4,500 years ago, 2,500 BC, because that's when Khufu reigned. That's how important these marks are. That's how Egyptology has basically nailed down the timeline. Yeah, it was a bit fluffy with Herodotus saying it was built 2,000 years ago, but the father of history, the father of lies, we don't know for sure. These marks, as Dr. Mark Lehner, the famous American Egyptologist, said, These marks gave Egyptology the clinching piece of evidence to finally nail the date down to 2500 BC to this King Khufu. That's how important these marks are. And when you take these marks away, they've got nothing left, nothing substantial, nothing solid to base the dating of this pyramid on.
Now, earlier when we were talking, you mentioned that there is actually some writing that is indisputably ancient that has been found inside the pyramid. And I'm guessing most people have probably at least heard of this by now, but why don't you talk about how that is relevant?
This again is another intriguing question. When Howard Weiss, I spoke earlier about him going into Wellington's chamber, he says he noticed some marks there, but nothing like hieroglyphics. And when you look at the marks that he talks about that were there, they're kind of strange, they're kind of geometric marks in a kind of half oblong shape. They just don't look like Egyptian hieroglyphics. They just don't. And that's why Weiss comments, there's some red marks there, but nothing that looks like hieroglyphics, because they simply don't look like hieroglyphics. So that's one set. So they're genuine. Those marks are genuine, okay? But they don't look like ancient Egyptians' mark. But they are genuine because Weiss discovered it. He tells us that. And he's hardly likely to make that up. So the other marks that we find in the Great Pyramid, they're in, your listeners might know that from the Queen's chamber of the Great Pyramid, there's a small shaft which runs from the southern wall and goes up through the body of the pyramid for a couple of 100 feet. At the end of this narrow shaft, this shaft is only about 8 inches square. There's a small cavity, or small cavity chamber as I call it. It's only about 1 foot square, this small cavity at the end of the shaft. And back in 2011, a robot was sent up the shaft and it managed to put a camera through there's a blocking stone at the end of the shaft. And an earlier robot had drilled a small hole through the centre of this blocking stone, and the robot in 2011 put an endoscopic camera through the small hole to see if there was anything in there. And what it found was these painted marks on the floor of this tiny cavity. Now, the thing about these marks is Egyptologists, they struggle to identify them. They don't know what they are. One Egyptologist who's a specialist in Egyptian numerology, numbers, Egyptian mathematics, thinks they might be the kind of, maybe look like there may be some numbers, the numbers 1, maybe the number 20, but he's not sure. It could be, maybe they are, maybe they're not. They're just like unlike regular ancient Egyptian marks, and certainly not like any of the marks inside the other chambers, which they're able to identify easily, right away, no problem. They can identify them, no problem at all. But these marks in this chamber, which are obviously clearly genuine builders' marks, they struggle with. So here we have genuine marks which Weiss found in Wellington's chamber, which were clearly original builders' marks. Here we have original builders' marks in this small shaft chamber, and none of them look like Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now that's curious. The other thing about the small shaft chamber is that if you go along, this shaft chamber is almost the exact same level as Campbell's chamber, which we were discussing earlier, where they found the famous Khufu cartouche. Now inside Campbell's chamber, there are also the numbers 1 and 20. And the thing is, Zechariah, they've been written in a completely different hieroglyphics. So they're trying to say one set of hieroglyphics might be the numbers 1 and 20, and another set of completely different hieroglyphics built at the exact same time are also the numbers 1 and 20. It just doesn't make sense. This is Egyptologists just making stuff up just to, it's just nonsense.
And that little square room at the end of that shaft is just bizarre.
Oh yeah, I mean it's well again, it's like what's it for? You
Yeah.
could speculate endlessly. Why is that there? Why did they need the shafts at all? What? I mean, I have my own views about that, which are in, as you know, they're in the previous book. But it's those things are just a complete mystery. It's just, but it's fascinating. That's the great thing about the Great Pyramid. It just, it's just got these endless secrets. The fascinations. Just sheer wonderment. It's great.
And of course, now they're saying that there may be other rooms that the sonar has picked up.
Well, yeah, I read a couple of reports about that a month or so ago, down in I think the northern part of Eastern. They've basically been doing some heat scanning, infrared scanning, and the differential rates at which the heat dissipates. They've managed to detect that there may be some chambers, hidden, unknown chambers at that level, but it may just be, a block of stone, isn't there? And they've just filled that particular area with sand. It's really hard to tell. But the thing is, it always seems to me that when Egyptology stumbles across something, it's almost as if they don't really want to find out what's there because it might upset the apple cart. It might upset the traditional narrative. And I think you kind of see this thing going on also with the tomb of Tutankhamun, where I think is it Reeves believes, British Egyptologist Reeves believes there's a couple of rooms off to the side of Tutankhamun's tomb, which we believe may be the tomb of Nefertiti. But there's all this acrimony going on just now. No, there's not. Yes, there is. No, there's not. Yes, there is. It's just like, well, just drill and find out. But it's like, oh no, we can't do that. That's intrusive. That's intrusive. What? You're ripping, coffins open. You're drilling holes into blocking stones at the end of the shaft of the southern chamber of the Queen's chamber of the Great Pyramid. You don't mind drilling holes there, so why can't you just drill a hole there? It's nonsense. It's like they're almost afraid sometimes, Zechariah, to dig too deep. It's almost as if they're afraid of what they might find. It's almost like back to this situation with Champollion when he was partially sponsored in one of his trips, I think 1828, when he went to Egypt. He was partially funded by the church on the proviso that he did not reveal or make known any texts which may undermine the teachings of the church. Champollion was opening Egypt up, opening the ancient texts, the ancient writings of Egypt up for the world.
Yeah.
But here was the church effectively clamping him, censoring him. Well, we've paid you to get here, buddy, so don't say anything that's going to undermine what we're saying. So in a sense, it's almost like a similar thing is going on here. Like they don't want to find certain things out just in case it upsets the apple cart. That's just my general sense. I could be totally wrong, but I just get that nagging feeling, and certainly with regards to these particular inscriptions in the Great Pyramid, I genuinely believe that the Egyptian authorities know they're fake. I genuinely believe they know for sure that they're fake. In fact, I've when my book came out, I actually received an email from an Egyptologist telling me that, yeah, you're right, we know they're fake. So I can't tell that person's name. I would love to, but I've got to protect my source.
Sure.
They know they're fake. But the thing about them, it's convenient. It's a convenient untruth, not an inconvenient truth, a convenient untruth for the Egyptologists. It helps to protect the prevailing narrative, yeah, and to keep everything in place. Everybody, all these, if they upset. If anybody comes out and says anything controversial, they'll be lucky to, get a research grant, to get a research permit, be lucky to get back in Egypt, So they've got to be careful, Egyptologists, what they say and what they do and who they say it to, and what they write, So there's a lot at stake for Egyptologists. So that's why I think. Excuse me, Zechariah. That's why I think it's important for the likes of Graham Hancock, Robert Breval, Robert Schoch, John Anthony West, Zechariah, myself, people, alternative researchers who are not hidebound to the conventional narrative in any way. It's important that us guys are here doing this stuff, pushing the boundaries, pushing the envelope, to get the facts out there or to get more facts out there and saying to people, well, look what we've found. Here's more information. Here's more facts. Make of it what you will. Egyptologists, I think, are almost afraid to do that sometimes, I think.
I feel like if these markings were legitimate and they knew they were legitimate, they wouldn't be so uptight about having someone carbon date them. Instead, they'd just be, let's carbon date and just make it, and prove that's the case. And I think, the fact that that they won't let any kind of carbon dating, they don't want people to see them in person, it does give that feeling that they know. Or at least that they're worried that could be the case, even if they don't know it for sure.
Yeah. Well, we were talking earlier, Soraya, about Gorlitz and Erdmann, Dr. Dominic Gorlitz and Stefan Erdmann, being in those chambers and taking that small sample from a lesser sign. Now, when they were accused by Hoax of taking paint from the cartouche, I'm not saying this was, but there's photographs that show the Khufu cartouche, a series of photographs from Dr. Colette Dowell, Dr. Robert Schoch, and a couple other people, which have been taken of the Khufu cartouche over a number of years, from I think 2002 right up to about 2010, 2011, something like that, maybe a bit later. And you can see little pieces of the frame, the oval frame of the cartouche of Khufu disappearing over that time spell. It's a snapshot. You can see that around the edge of the cartouche, little bits of paint have disappeared. Now, that could be the Egyptian authorities taking samples from the cartouche to test themselves. It would be amazing to me that they haven't done these tests, because at the end of the day, if they haven't done these tests, then what they're basically saying is that these marks in the Great Pyramid are basically authenticated only on the word of a British colonel who was a known fraudster.
Right.
He committed electoral fraud in 1807. He was accused of other unpleasantries while he was in Giza in 1837. So this is the kind of guy we're dealing with. That's Egyptology's best evidence that these marks are fake, that, the word of a British colonel, he's from a prestigious family with close connections to the British aristocracy, Colonel Vyse wouldn't do a thing like that. Well, I'm sorry, but the evidence begs to differ.
What do you think it's going to take for there to be like a revolution in Egyptology to acknowledge some of this stuff, test some of this stuff? Do you think it's going to be a changing of the guard, or do you think it's going to take more than that?
Well, I think what will probably happen. I mean, this is one of the reasons for me writing this book and researching and uncovering all this new evidence, Zechariah, is to try and put some pressure on the Egyptian authorities to do some proper disclosure on these marks, to get real science into these chambers, because at the end of the day, if they don't do real science on these marks, then this book is now out there. It's already making some waves, and it's got a lot of evidence to show that those marks are not genuine. They're Victorian fakes. A lot of evidence, as I said there, to support that. So what are they going to do? Are they going to just ignore this book? Well, yeah, that's kind of one of the things that they do. They just ignore it, hoping it'll go away. But you know what? This book is not going to go away. The evidence is not going to go away. And sooner or later, Egyptology is going to have to face up to that. And they're going to have to address this particular question. They're going to have to do their own science, in an open and transparent manner. Because if it's not open and transparent, it's all done behind closed doors, then I'm afraid they'll have a hard job convincing me that it's been done properly. Put it that way.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. All right. The book is The Great Pyramid Hoax: The Conspiracy to Conceal the True History of Ancient Egypt. You are Scott Creighton, and I very highly recommend this book. You have done a phenomenal amount of work here. I can't imagine what it was like going over those journals like you did. It's a fantastic piece of work, and you make an exceptionally good argument that these things, at very least, need to be tested for authenticity, and it's something that can be done and should be done. But I mean, really, if this was a case going to trial, you have a pretty good chance of winning in with the evidence you present in this book. Where can people find you online? You probably know, Zechariah, that I have my own forum over on abovetopsecret.com. If they go to the forum page there, they'll see my name, Scott Creighton, down one of the forums alongside the author Jim Mars. We're kind of side by side on Above Top Secret, or that's probably the best place to they can go on there. They can start a thread, ask a question, and I can pop in and answer their questions. Alternatively, they can write to my publisher. And your publisher is Inner Traditions.
Yeah, that's correct. Inner Traditions Bearing Company.
Yes. All right. I thank you very much for spending some time with us, Scott.
It's been an absolute pleasure once again, Zechariah. Thanks for having me here.